Hey everybody, in this short video I want to show you how to add a realistic shadow that is cast across the foreground like what you see here. Let me turn that shadow off for just a second so you can see what I mean. The shadow that's being cast from the bottom of Corbin's feet across towards the penguins is what we're going to add. You need to start out with an image like we see here, a background image of your choice. You take another image like we have here and you make a selection using the quick select tool or another method. Make a good selection, apply a mask to that, and then bring that, drag that layer into this picture so you have something like this. So that's where you should be at this point in the to continue with this video. We have two layers here, the background and my person, which is a masked layer here called layer 1. First thing we're going to do to proceed is we need to apply this layer mask. So you can go ahead and select the mask, the black and white mask, right click it and say apply layer mask. You see the mask goes away. Now we're just left with the layer with the cutaway background. The next thing we need to do is copy this layer so that we can turn it into our shadow. Control J will give me a copy of the current layer. With that layer selected, hit Control T, which is your free transform tool. And with the Control key, come up and select the top handle, top center handle, and bring and just drag the shadow in the direction you want it to go. You can also click inside the selection and move it so that the bottom, the very end of the shadow is lining up with the feet here. You can also click and drag the shadow, make it a little bit bigger if you need to, get it so it's about the right size and the right direction. It's important that your shadow is being cast in the same direction that you see the shadow being cast from other objects in the picture. And as you can see, the penguins here are casting a shadow almost directly towards the left. And so we want the same to happen with this shadow that's being cast from our main subject. Alright, once that looks pretty good, you hit the check mark up here to finish your transform. The next thing we need to do now is we want to fill this selection with a gradient fill from black to white. And before we can do that, we need to make a selection. So holding the Control key, click here in the layer icon of the shadow layer. Let me call that layer shadow just to keep it straight here. And now we see when we control click on that, we get our selection back. We have the selection of the shadow. And then we come up and we find our gradient tool. You can press the G on the keyboard to find your gradient tool here. Come up and click in the gradient color pattern. Choose the third gradient over, which is the black to white, and say OK. Then with that gradient tool selected and with your selection made on this layer, click and drag from one side of that gradient or one side of that selection to the other, and you'll see it'll fill it with your black to white color. You can hit Control D to deselect, and now what we want to do is with this layer selected, come up and switch it from normal blend mode to multiply. This will make the shadow actually be a little more see-through, so you can see the textures below on the layer below it, and that's what multiply does. Okay, and we see that now what I can do is take the shadow and drag it down one layer position so that it's now behind the other layer, and that looks pretty good. The very last step in order to make this a little bit more realistic looking, we want to do two things. We want to add a little bit of a Guassian blur, and then we also want to change the opacity level of this shadow. So with that shadow layer selected, come up to Filter, Blur, Guassian Blur. And with the window placed out of the way like this, take a look at how the shadow's being affected when you drag this radius slider. You don't want too much of a shadow because we can see over here on the left the shadows from the penguins are pretty sharp. They're not too blurry, so we don't want this one to be too blurry either. Once you get the selection right, hit OK. The last thing you can do is come up and find the opacity setting and reduce that just a little bit so that our shadow is a little bit more see-through. Looks pretty good. There's one last thing I think we need to do to this particular image, however, is that both the image of Corbin as well as the shadow here are not quite the same color as the rest of the picture. And so we want to add a little bit of a color filter to that. So I'm going to first select the picture of Corbin and come up, first of all, control click on that layer icon so I get a selection of him, and come on up and choose the camera image here. It's called a photo filter adjustment layer. Click on that, change the warming filter setting to a cooling filter. There's several there you can choose from. You can try which one looks best in your opinion. Okay, and once you have that, you can adjust it a little bit. And you'll see what that does is it puts a little bit more of a blue cast to the subject matter because the setting they're in is a bit more blue. We can do the same for the shadow, which also needs to be made a little blue. So I'm going to check my shadow layer, control click on that to get the selection of the pixels, and then do the same thing. Add a color filter, photo filter, excuse me, and change it to the cooling filter color. And you can see that's changed the color of the shadow now also to the same color as the shadows around it. That looks a lot better. Alright, so that's a quick way to make a realistic looking cast shadow in a Photoshop document. Hope this has been helpful.